I want you to imagine a June morning in Richmond, British Columbia, 1989. A man out for a walk finds an abandoned house off a back lane. He steps closer and sees a woman's body on the lawn. Her hands and feet are bound. A nylon stocking is looped around her neck. There's no sign of a fight nearby. 2 weeks earlier, her car had been found, abandoned, groceries in the trunk, blood inside. The woman's name was Cindy James. The question that follows her death is simple and devastating. Was this the final act of a long, sad pattern of stalking and murder, or the tragic end of an inner struggle that took a darker, elaborate shape? That ambiguity has never gone away. Officially, the case was later closed as an accidental or undetermined death. But for decades, people have asked different, loud questions. Was she failed by the system? Was she failed by herself? Who, if anyone, did this to Cindy? Today, we're not here to sensationalize. We're here to look carefully at the record, the people, and the unanswered gaps. This is still Unanswered. I'm Mara Ellison. Content warning up front. In this episode, we'll talk about stalking, threats, physical assaults, drug overdose, and death. If any of that could be triggering, please know I'll leave a list of resources at the end of the episode. We'll get to them before we sign off. Also, I want to be clear about our approach. No dramatic music cues, no wild speculation presented as fact. We'll go slowly, separate evidence from theory, and humanize the real person at the center of the story, Cindy. And we'll be joined by Dr. Stephen Lau, a forensic psychologist who consults on stalking and trauma cases. Stephen helps us keep the psychological frameworks honest and the limits of inference visible. Stephen, welcome.
Thanks, Mara. It's good to be here. I appreciate the careful tone you're setting.
So before we go into the investigative timeline, I want to spend a minute on who Cindy was outside the headlines. One of the problems with cases like this is that over time, a person becomes shorthand, the stalker victim, or worse, the fabricator. But Cindy had a life before the fear took over. She trained and worked as a nurse. She worked with children. Friends and family described her as conscientious, sometimes private, somebody who took care of others. She married a man named Roy, Dr. Roy Makepeace, and they separated. Beyond those facts, the public record gets thin, and that absence is important. It's easy for a narrative to flatten someone when the full human context is missing.
That flattening matters a great deal. When people are reduced to a single narrative, victim or perpetrator, it affects how we read reports, how we judge inconsistencies, and how we treat evidence. In clinical work, I try to hold multiple possibilities in mind while recognizing the personhood of the client. That's the tone we should bring here.
Exactly. All right. The harassment, as it's often called in the record, begins in 1982 or thereabouts, shortly after Cindy and Roy separated. The calls and notes began. Anonymous threats, strange phone calls in the middle of the night, and things left at her house. She reported these to police on multiple occasions. At first, these were a handful of incidents. It sounded like cruel pranks. But over time, they escalated into events that left her physically harmed, or at least found in states that suggested harm. There are reports of needle marks, slashed clothing, and episodes where she was discovered bound and semi-conscious. Stephen, when a case starts like this, repeated, anonymous harassment, what does that look like from a behavioral perspective?
From the behavioral side, repetitive, anonymous harassment usually follows a pattern: attention, escalation, and sometimes physical proximity. Stalking, broadly defined, is a pattern of intrusive behavior that causes fear or distress. Early on, law enforcement, especially in the 1980s, often treated these incidents as separate pranks instead of as cumulative danger. That misreading can be dangerous because escalation is one of the clear risk factors for serious violence. But we also have to be careful. The records in Cindy's case sometimes show limited corroboration. Some events lacked witnesses or forensic traces. That's where the ambiguity deepens.
Right. And because it's the crux of the debate about Cindy's life and death, I want to walk listeners through some of the specific incidents that were reported over the years. In one episode, she was found with a stocking tied around her neck, alive, apparently, by someone who lived nearby. On other occasions, she was found unconscious with cuts and apparent needle marks. There's at least one report of her being hogtied in her apartment. Friends would sometimes find her. At other times, she'd make the reports herself. She repeatedly told police she felt terrorized. Police did surveillance, they set up stakeouts, and, according to some accounts, listened in on calls. But despite those efforts, no suspect was definitively arrested for the harassment that preceded her death. Stephen, how do investigators weigh incidents that are primarily testimony against the absence of physical evidence?
Investigators rely on both testimonial and physical evidence, but each carries different weight. Physical evidence, DNA, fingerprints, forced entry, CCTV, provides direct linkage. Testimony establishes the pattern and the subjective impact. In stalking cases, patterns of behavior and corroboration from multiple independent witnesses can be powerful. But when incidents lack witnesses or physical traces, investigators may be forced into a cautious posture. Is this a repeat victimization, or is the pattern being created in part by the claimant? Both possibilities must be considered. Unfortunately, bias plays into those judgments. Gendered assumptions about credibility, stigma around mental illness, and a historical tendency to minimize harassment. Those biases can skew investigations either toward disbelief or toward confirmation of an outer perpetrator without sufficient proof.
You used the word credibility, and I want to stop on that for a second. In the Cindy case, some officers reportedly became skeptical over time. Accounts in the record suggest frustration on the police side, years of investigations with no solid leads. That's not unique to this story, but it matters because skepticism can harden into a presumption that events were fabricated. That presumption then reshapes how evidence is collected, or if it's collected at all. At the same time, Cindy's family and some friends remained adamant that she was being stalked and that the attacks were real. Who do you trust when the official tools fail?
You trust both the person who reports harm and you concurrently demand rigorous investigative methods. That is, you hold both compassion and professional skepticism. When official tools fail, when there are no fingerprints, no witnesses, investigators should ramp up protective measures for the potential victim and seek alternative corroboration. Phone records, behavioral analysts, neighborhood canvassing. But emotionally, people closest to the target often have access to patterns that police may not see because they are in the day-to-day. Their convictions shouldn't be dismissed out of hand. This case shows how failure in procedure and failure in empathy can coexist.
Let's move into the escalation phase. Around the mid to late 1980s, incidents became more physically serious. Some of the most disturbing accounts include situations where Cindy was found hogtied or with bindings that some observers later suggested could be self-inflicted. There's also the question of the nylon stocking, which recurs in multiple incidents. At least one time, she was found with a stocking around her neck and also with puncture marks on her arms. The presence or absence of forced entry is important. In several episodes, there wasn't evidence of forced entry. That fact is one reason some investigators thought she might have staged events herself, while others argue a perpetrator could have had access or used deception. Stephen, how does the detail of bindings and lack of forced entry shape interpretations?
Bindings and the presence or absence of forced entry are critical, but not determinative. A lack of forced entry could mean the victim let the person in, or it could mean the offender had legitimate access, or had a way to get in without leaving obvious signs. As for bindings, experts can sometimes distinguish self-binding from bindings applied by another person based on knot patterns, tension, and signs of struggle. But the analysis is often complicated by decomposition, later handling of the body, or poor documentation at the scene. In Cindy's case, there were observers, some neighbors, some medical personnel, who had differing impressions about whether the bindings were consistent with self-application. That disagreement is one of the many reasons the record is ambiguous.
There's a point here that I want to make explicit. Inconsistencies in such assessments don't always mean someone's lying. They can mean poor forensic documentation, different expertise levels among first responders, or even later reinterpretation when people look back with new theories. The same knot that looks suspicious to one person might look innocent to another, especially if the scene was not preserved or photographed thoroughly. So we have to parse three parallel threads: Cindy's reports and experiences, the physical findings, and the investigative response, all of which were imperfect in different ways.
Yes, and add to that the passage of time. Memories degrade, records get lost, and later retellings can unintentionally add or subtract detail. That's why, as clinicians and consultants, we often stress contemporaneous documentation, police logs, hospital charts, photographs. When those are missing or incomplete, uncertainty grows and becomes fertile ground for competing narratives.
Which brings us to the final days and the discovery of Cindy's body. The way her disappearance and death unfolded is itself tangled. Her car was found, abandoned, with groceries in the trunk and blood inside. Some personal items were scattered. That was the first alarm. Then, about 2 weeks later, her body was found near that abandoned house I mentioned in the cold open. She was partially clothed, her hands and feet were bound. There was the nylon stocking around her neck. Toxicology later showed a potentially lethal dose of drugs in her system. Those details have been marshaled on both sides of the argument. People who think murder point to the bindings, the stalking, the history of harassment. People who think suicide or staged incidents point to the toxicology and the possibility that the bonds could be self-applied. Stephen, how do you sit with those competing interpretations?
I sit with them as competing hypotheses, both of which need careful testing. The presence of a lethal concentration of drugs suggests the death could have been due to overdose, intentionally or accidentally. The bindings, the location of the body, and the history of threats suggest the possibility of homicide staged to look like self-harm. In the absence of DNA or a witness, we try to triangulate toxicology, scene context, the victim's prior behavior, and known escalation factors for stalking. Each element nudges us toward one hypothesis or another, but none proves it conclusively. This is a place where many people feel discomfort. The truth might not be knowable with certainty, and we must resist the urge to settle on the neatest narrative.
And of course, the official determinations themselves were not static. Inquests and coroner's findings shifted over time. Initially undetermined in some phrasing, and later characterized in ways that, to some observers, read as accidental or death by unknown means. Cindy's family, however, maintained that she had been murdered by a stalker and that the system had failed to take her reports seriously. Those differing conclusions drove months and years, decades of public debate. Stephen, how much do official labels matter in a case like this? I mean, whether the coroner writes accidental or undetermined, does that change the reality for the family, for the investigative process, for public perception?
Official labels matter a lot. They shape resource allocation, investigative focus, and public sympathy. An accidental determination can close investigative avenues and reduce public pressure to continue inquiries. Conversely, homicide opens up leads, warrants, and renewed investigation. But labels are also social signals. They affect how family, media, and communities talk about the case. When labels appear mismatched with lived experience, when a family believes murder but an official label leans another way, that mismatch can deepen mistrust in institutions. That mistrust plays into subsequent alternative theories, some productive and some harmful.
Let's talk about psychological lenses carefully, since we have you here, Stephen. People have offered different psychological explanations for the events surrounding Cindy. Some have suggested trauma responses or complex PTSD from prolonged harassment could explain behavior that looks inconsistent or self-endangering. Others have floated the possibility of factitious disorder or even deliberate staging. We must tread lightly. We don't, and legally can't, diagnose someone retrospectively without records and a clinical interview. But there are frameworks that help explain how either genuine victimization or internal struggles could look on the outside. Could you unpack those frameworks and the ethical limits of applying them to Cindy?
Certainly. First, chronic trauma or prolonged stalking can produce symptoms like hypervigilance, dissociation, memory gaps, panic attacks, behaviors that might read as inconsistent to outsiders. Victims can have fragmented recollections of incidents and may present to hospitals in confused or altered states. Second, complex PTSD from repeated interpersonal trauma can lead to self-harm, risky behaviors, or even reenactments without meaning to fake anything. Third, factitious disorder, by contrast, is intentionally producing or feigning symptoms for psychological reasons, but it's rare and serious to assert. The ethical limit is this. Without contemporaneous clinical records or a diagnostic interview, it's inappropriate to declare a diagnosis. Instead, we can describe symptom clusters and plausible psychological mechanisms, always emphasizing uncertainty. Importantly, these frameworks are not mutually exclusive. Someone can be both genuinely harmed by an external perpetrator and also struggle with behaviors that complicate the story.
That last point is essential. Human experience resists tidy categories. People can both suffer real external harm and wrestle with internal difficulties that make their accounts look inconsistent. The danger is twofold: to dismiss credible reports of stalking because of mental health stigma, and to assume mental health struggles automatically imply fabrication. Both mistakes have serious consequences. In Cindy's case, we simply don't have the full clinical record in the public domain, and that vacuum has been filled repeatedly by speculation.
Right, and speculation tends to polarize public opinion, either saints or villains. As an expert, my job when consulted is to say, here are what the behaviors could indicate, here are what we actually know, and here are the limits of inference. That way, decisions, police, legal, or family, can be better informed.
Let's walk back into the harmful narratives that often take hold in these discussions. Over the years, the Cindy James case has inspired many theories. Some argue for an unknown sadistic stalker who escalated to murder. Others point to the ex-husband, Roy, and suggest foul play connected to the marital split. Still others say Cindy staged incidents herself, culminating in an accidental overdose or suicide. In our review, none of those theories is sealed by the record. I want to call out a couple of common pitfalls in how people tell this story. First, cherry-picking the most dramatic detail, say the nylon stocking, and using it as definitive proof while ignoring things like the toxicology levels or the lack of forced entry. Second, after-the-fact reinterpretation, looking at an ambiguous knot and, with the distance of hindsight, turning it into a smoking gun. And third, the message board effect. Repeated retelling can ossify speculation into apparent fact.
And we should add the media effect. The early media coverage sometimes framed Cindy in ways that invited either sympathy or skepticism, and subsequent pieces often leaned into the most compelling narrative for an audience. That's not unique to this case, but it distorts public understanding. Responsible coverage requires presenting uncertainty clearly and avoiding the temptation to reduce a story to a clear villain or clean solution when the evidence doesn't support that.
I agree. So let's be explicit about what remains unanswered, because that's the heart of the podcast. Here are the core questions still open. Who, if anyone, was behind the anonymous threats and harassing incidents? How did Cindy end up bound and drugged where she was found? How did the drugs enter her system, given the absence of consistent injection marks reported in public records? Would more modern forensic techniques, like refined DNA analysis, a fresh review of physical evidence, or digital phone metadata, have changed the investigation? And finally, was the level of investigative scrutiny and victim protection proportionate to the risk she reported facing? Each of those questions has plausible answers in both directions, and crucially, some answers may never be known.
Yes, and I'd add a human question. Beyond the mechanics of death or suspected perpetrator, what supports were offered to someone in persistent fear? Were there adequate safety plans, community supports, or mental health interventions? Often, those practical elements are the difference between someone continuing to survive and someone who ultimately doesn't. When examining cold cases, we're sometimes so focused on who did what that we neglect what could have been done to reduce harm in real time.
That's a powerful point. So, what can we learn from Cindy's case lessons for systems, for friends and family, and for listeners who might witness someone living under threat? First, take repeated reports of harassment seriously, even if each individual event lacks forensic proof. Pattern is important. Second, document everything contemporaneously. Police need logs, hospitals need clear charts, families should keep copies. Third, combine compassion with appropriate skepticism. Protect the person while seeking objective evidence. Fourth, be aware of how gender and mental health stigma can undermine credibility. Actively guard against those biases. Fifth, recognize the limits of our conclusions. Not every puzzle has an answer we can confirm. Any other practical takeaways, Stephen?
Yes. Train first responders to see stalking as an escalating risk. Provide accessible, trauma-informed support for those reporting harassment. Use multidisciplinary teams, police, victim advocates, mental health professionals to manage complex, persistent cases. And finally, when a person's reports challenge our assumptions, we must err on the side of protection while still working the evidence, because protection doesn't mean abandoning inquiry. It means doing both at once.
Before we close, I want to return to Cindy as a human. Sometimes we get lost in diagrams, timeline, evidence map, theories, and forget the person who lived and left relationships behind. Her family continues to feel the loss and the unresolved grief. Friends remember someone who laughed, who cared for children, who was more than the episodes that consumed the last years of her life. In thinking about this, I've tried to hold both: the curiosity about how it all happened and the humility that we might never be sure. Stephen, any final reflections on how to hold that tension, curiosity and humility responsibly?
It's a practice. You cultivate curiosity without rush to closure, and you cultivate humility by acknowledging limits in the record and in your own knowledge. You also center the human consequences. What your curiosity costs. Are you re-traumatizing family? Are you amplifying harmful rumors? Being responsible means pursuing answers while protecting dignity. In cases like Cindy's, we must be honest about ambiguity and cautious about certainty.
Thank you. That honesty matters. As we wrap, here are the things I want to leave listeners with. 1. This episode was an effort to compile the documented facts, to present the competing interpretations, and to model careful thinking. 2. None of what we discussed should be taken as a definitive legal or clinical judgment. Those are the purview of courts and clinicians with direct access to records. 3. The unresolved nature of the Cindy James case is itself a lesson about how systems respond to repeated allegations of harm and how those responses can shape outcomes in ways we may never fully understand. I'm going to read a short list of resources for anyone listening who was affected by anything in this episode. If you are in immediate danger, call your local emergency number now. If you are experiencing stalking or harassment in Canada, victim services and provincial victim support lines can help. Call your local police and ask for victim services. The Canadian Centre for Victims of Crime has resources online. In the U.S., the National Domestic Violence Hotline is 1-800-799-SAFE 7233. Or text START to 88788. The National Suicide and Crisis Lifeline in the U.S. is 988. If you're outside those countries, please contact your local health services for crisis lines. If you need emotional support, consider contacting local mental health services or a community crisis center.
Also, for listeners wanting to learn more about stalking and its management, the Stalking Prevention, Awareness, and Resource Center, SPARC, has valuable materials. And for clinicians and investigators, there are trauma-informed protocols that improve outcomes. I can recommend some reading if listeners reach out to the show.
We'll put links to those resources, plus archival material and the sources we used, in the episode notes. One last thought before we go. Cindy James's case remains, for many, a haunting example of unresolved harm. It asks uncomfortable questions about belief and disbelief, about how we interpret messy evidence, and about the limits of systems designed to protect people. Holding that mess is difficult, but it's also necessary. Thank you, Stephen, for joining me and helping us hold that complexity.
Thank you, Mara, and thank you to your listeners for approaching this with the care it deserves.
If you found this episode meaningful, please consider subscribing to Still Unanswered and leaving a review. Reviews help other people find the show. If you'd like to suggest a case for us to look at, or if you have documents related to Cindy's case you think we should know about, please get in touch through our website. We will treat any materials you send with respect and confidentiality. I'm Mara Ellison. This has been Still Unanswered. We'll be back with another case soon.